folks on the call, a lot of times, especially with the comment that was just made, people make the false equivalency between the immigrant vote and the Latino vote. In fact, most Latinos are not immigrants, and most Latino voters are not naturalized citizens. One way to think about the immigrant vote is to look at the share of registered voters who are foreign born. And if you look at it that way, Asian Americans are 28% nationally, 38% in California, roughly proportional to the Latino population. We also have a significant proportion of white naturalized citizens who are eligible to vote nationally and in California, and significant Black populations if you look nationally as well. So this is something that's critical, I think, for journalists to appreciate. Next slide. Right now, this is preliminary data from a survey that's in the field right now. It'll be released in September. And this is data that's been collected through August 16th of Asian Americans. And what we find is that Asian Americans heavily favor Biden over Trump, but you still have 16% that are undecided. So they're still relatively persuadable compared to the general US population. Next slide. And yet at the same time, party contact has not been forthcoming. So 56% say that they have not been contacted by Democrats, 59% say they have not been contacted by Republicans. Our latest blog post on API Data has these numbers and some explanation. Next slide. All right, so that's on the API Data side. But to say a little bit about work that we've done in California with California Common Cause in terms of focus groups with low propensity voters and the vote by mail system that is going to be spread throughout California. Next slide. So in terms of the overview, what we tried to do is to assess the needs for low propensity voters in November, probe awareness about voting options and voting mode preferences, exploring messages that motivate and inform these groups, and to deliver recommendations to community organizations as well as election officials. Next slide. So we worked with a lot of community partners in doing this work. Their assistance was invaluable in terms of identifying focus group partners, as well as running some of the focus groups where we didn't have language capacity. Next slide. We also had the involvement of county registrars. Again, that was super helpful because our recommendations inform not only the outreach work by community organizations, but also the materials that are going to be sent out by county registrars as well as the Secretary of State. This has been supported by the Haas Junior Fund. Next slide. Let's just skip this slide in the interest of time. And this slide as well. So key impressions and lessons. One, trusted messengers and their information sources vary according to the group. There is an elevated preference for vote by mail or drop off because of COVID-19. There's concerns about mail-in ballot, the kind of link to track it and whether the vote will be counted. There's concerns about drop-off boxes in terms of where they are and their availability. It's important to explain verification and tracking services, and that helps alleviate some of the vote by mail concerns. And then there's some broader recommendations as well. And community expertise was so critical. You know, often we think that, of course, we go far when we look to professors as experts, but there's a ton of community expertise, and it was great to have that engagement. Next slide. In terms of who the trusted messengers are, community anchor organizations, official election sources, including online and deadlines for rules, family and friends among those who use word of mouth, traditional media and ethnic media, including radio, television, and print, as well as social media, especially that there's mountains of research in political science that says that mobilization makes a difference. You know, that is actually one of the challenging things in the age of COVID, is that what the research has shown is that door-to-door and face-to-face outreach tends to be the most effective, followed by individual phone calls, and then followed by mailers, and then followed by robocalls. Those tend to be the least effective. So what will be important is to have multiple touch points. And sadly, what we're seeing is actually very few touch points. Part of it is for Asian Americans, they're less likely to live in battleground states. So they're less likely to be reached out to. But let's remember that, you know, there are important congressional elections. There are a bunch of congressional elections where districts flipped in 2018 that have significant API populations. And so we really should be seeing more outreach than we've seen so far. I think it's, when you approach the issue of fraud, I think we need to be careful here, because at least from prior evidence, the risk of voter disenfranchisement has been much larger and well documented than any risk of fraud that has been minuscule and not well established. So the reason why I say that is we actually could get into a situation where misperception about fraud might actually reduce turnout, and we absolutely do not want that to happen. We can always run audits based on if mail ballots were sent, in terms of whether they reached their destination and whether they got held up. But we absolutely do not want people holding back from participating in vote by mail because of, any concerns about fraud. As far as I understand it, especially with the U.S. Postal Service, there's a lot of congressional inquiries right now to ensure that those pieces get to their destinations on time and that they are not bottlenecked up in some distribution center somewhere. But that is something that is ultimately traceable. If people refrain from voting by mail because of concerns over fraud, that, I would argue, is the most damage that could be done in terms of ensuring as much turnout as possible among our populations.